Kevin Lee, how are you this afternoon?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk.
Yeah. Well, you came by way of another previous guest, Kevin Frazier, who was fantastic. He's another academic like yourself down at the University of Texas. We had such a great conversation, and I saw that you and him were collaborating on some projects and did a little digging, found some of your stuff to be super interesting. So that's a good segue into an introduction. Why don't you tell everybody who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Well, let me first say that coming in after Kevin Frazier is filling some big shoes. So I appreciate the opportunity. My name's Kevin Lee. I am currently the Intel chair at North Carolina Central University, and I have been involved with legal technology for about a decade, which kind of surprises me when I look back at it. I write and teach in the area of AI policy and AI ethics. And I have a very diverse background. I practice commercial law in the U.S. and in Japan, and I have uh, done graduate work at the University of Chicago in social and political ethics, and I have taught jurisprudence my entire career. There's an unusual background to be bringing into legal technology, but yeah, I mean, um, about 10 years ago, I started seeing the changes that were occurring in the profession, and I said, man, we have to get serious about understanding how law is changing uh, in the basic assumptions about how it works and how it's located in society. And so I've been studying and researching that for like I say about a decade now.
Well, yeah, and when you talk about legal technology, historically they've been slightly overlapping, right? The practice of law and technology. There has been some overlap there, and as the direction things seem to be moving, the more those concentric circles seem to be lining up on top of each other. So you picked a good spot to be, right? I mean, there's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I picked it or it picked me, but yeah, it's been fascinating to watch. I happened to in my Facebook feed to today. I had a memory from 8 years ago reading Kevin Ashley's wonderful book on artificial intelligence and law from probably about 10-year-old book now. And boy, have we seen a lot of change since that book came out. It's still a great book, and I mean, it's really worth reading. But that's well before large language models, and that's a game changer. It's been quite a wild ride,
Yeah,
especially the last 3 years, frankly.
yeah, and I've been in technology, so I'm 53. I started in fifth grade when they brought Apple II. So this would have been 1982, maybe, and they
Hmm.
brought some Apple IIs into the classroom in fifth or sixth grade. And I wasn't the best student uh, in my early years. I ended up pulling it together and getting focused. But I was waking my mom up early to get me to school because, and I didn't tell her why. I don't think I was like keeping a secret or anything. I was just like, hey, I want to go to school early, and didn't elaborate. It's because the computer time, if you got to school early, you could spend 45 minutes on the apples.
Ah.
And my mom was like, she didn't ask the first couple of times. She's just like, this is weird. Um, and then from there, I just got totally immersed. And then I took a break during high school because girls don't love the computer guys, So I took a break while I had to act cool, and then got back into it during college. But my fascination with AI started with Deep Blue and Jeopardy.
Hmm.
Remember? And then I was a little bit of a chess player. Okay. Nothing, I never competed. And I remember, I think it was Kasparov getting beat, and then AlphaGo, the AlphaGo project really drew me in, but I didn't totally dive headfirst into AI until ChatGPT. That was really the moment I fell off a cliff and I'm neck deep these days.
I have a little bit older than you. I have a distinct memory of being in law school back long enough ago when the Macs were new and they had these HyperCard programs where you could actually build links between pages, and make networks like that. And I had a friend who was very interested in trying to actually link um, articles in, I forget what he was using, probably the Constitution or something, but to cases.
Mm.
So that as sort of a study aid, and he spent manually making the connections and building effectively like a little expert system. And that was probably about the time when when you were getting your Apple II experience. I was already in law school. So yeah, it's been quite a I mean, it's been fascinating to watch over the years how it developed. And then, like you mentioned, AlphaGo, that for me was, my father's Korean, and
Mm.
I grew up playing Go. And I know how hard that game is. I never beat him actually, but I know how hard that game is to play and to see that. And I understood the significance of what it had accomplished at that time. And, that to me was a creative act to win in that way. Just amazing. And that, yeah, you could tell everything was going to change like in a heartbeat after that.
Yeah, for the for those that aren't familiar with that AlphaGo story, there's a movie, a documentary. I think it's available. I think I watched it on YouTube. It's fantastic, and that was Dennis Hassabis in his early days during DeepMind. That's now a part of Google, and he's one of kind of the elder statesmen of AI and a very well respected figure. There's a lot of controversy these days with some of the players in the space. I mean, Sam Altman, uh, obviously Elon Musk, very controversial. But Dennis is one of those characters that seems to transcend the controversy and seems to be kind of the elder statesman
Right.
of the group. So yeah, I'd encourage people to watch that who haven't. But getting into the agenda, you teach lawyers how to think ethically about AI, and I had a guest on. I have to tell this story really quick. I had a guest on who his name's Raymond Sun. He's of Asian descent, but he lives in Australia,
Hmm.
and he's an attorney for one of the big law firms there. And he was telling me how he got into AI, and it was around ethics. So it was self-driving cars, and the programming where a self-driving car approaches a unavoidable collision, and you've got an older person and a baby, and you have to hit one of them. Which one do you hit? Right? How do you write the code that
Right.
makes that decision? And that really kind of opened my eyes, like, wow, okay, that's a very stark example of ethics in AI. But tell me about what it is that you teach lawyers about AI ethics.
Yeah. So let me first begin by saying I'm teaching at an HBCU, and I think that matters to the class that uh, you have to meet the needs of the students. So let me start with that. There's a sort of famous problem that was developed by Philippa Foot in the '70s called the trolley car problem, which is essentially, this is very famous. You have a trolley car going down the track. There are five people ahead of you, and you can pull a lever, go off to a sidetrack, and you'll kill one to save the five. And should you do it? And I always start with that. So very, you know, it's just to get them thinking. But first of all, what I teach, if you ask a group of students, it's very interesting to ask a group of students that question, and almost everyone will pull the lever. It's rare. It's pretty rare. I mean, you'll find one or two in each class, but most people will pull the lever. And why? And you begin to ask them, well, why? And they'll have a lot of things to say. And then I like to pivot and say, now imagine you're an ER doctor and you have five people who come in probably from a trolley car accident, and they're all going to die, and they all need an organ transplant, right? Now you have a assistant in the back who's kind of asleep and he's not very useful anyway. Can I kill him and harvest his organs to save the other five, right? And of course they'll say, no one would say that. Well, what's the difference in the cases, really? And that's where you begin to for them to understand that what they're doing is, I like to say, rational reflection on these sort of moral feelings that we have, right? And that's really the beginning of ethics. What I try to do with the students is to give them some of the standard ways of thinking about ethics, uh, virtue ethics, rights-based ethics, utilitarianism, um, and then look at how those are being used in policy today, right? So you can go from the ethics to policy. Why do you do that? You know, one of the important goals, I think, if you study the sort of history of legal pedagogy uh, over the last 30, 40 years, one of the issues has been how do we teach lawyers to be more like doctors? You know, doctors usually have a good grounding in medical ethics. Our ethics courses that we teach in law school are often, how close can you come to the edge before you get in trouble? And that they're not, experiential, and they're not really grappling with the deeper issues. So this gets to be a matter of sort of forming the professional identity for the lawyers. We can get them more involved in understanding what's at stake. And I think it's a great exercise today. There's a new ABA standard that's actually requiring us to teach professional identity formation in a tangible way in law school. That's only a couple of years old now. I know a lot of schools are still struggling to figure out a curriculum for doing that. And so that's one reason that I want to do this, is to develop, respond to that curricular need. At an HBCU school, I think it's particularly important for two reasons. I mean, one is just in general, developing well-developed identities and sense of self is an important issue. And then the second is, if you look at the kind of incident reports, sort of things about how AI goes wrong, it often has to do with bias and discriminatory, implicit discrimination. And so for my students to develop a sort of moral sense of the profession as being responsible for responding to those kinds of problems really fits the mission of the school as well, right? So we're kind of building professional identities around social justice and concern for discriminatory outcomes. And it's really well documented. Ultimately, though, I also like to tell them and show them that ultimately responding to those critiques is essential for developing the products in ways that'll be actually broadly acceptable, right? So it's not just, I mean, it's great social justice, but it also makes good practical sense to try and be able to understand how, a product's impacting the whole population. And so, and I think for lawyers nowadays, it's really essential to have that as a basic platform for developing their leadership in as sort of lawyer statesmen in a practice, often a multinational practice nowadays too. So yeah, very, very, what should I say, very broad goals that we have for it. And so far, it's been pretty successful, I hope.
Well, good stuff. Yeah, I think I mentioned it when you and I last spoke. I tried a very simple exercise on I frequently compare the output of primarily the four big models out there, which are ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and Grok. And
Mm.
I happened to see a caricature of a couple of people I know on LinkedIn. Might have told you about this. And it looked like neither one of them. It was clearly AI generated. And I was like, but the guy in the front of the picture, he looks like somebody, some actor. Who is it? So just for giggles, I posted it into ChatGPT and said, what famous person does the guy giving the thumbs up in the picture look like? And it flat out refused. They gave no
Mhm.
reasoning behind it. I uploaded it to Claude, and I pulled Claude up while we were talking here to get what it said. It basically said, I can't identify who specific people in images look like or compare them to famous individuals, as this could involve making assumptions about people's identities based on their appearance, which I thought was interesting. So then I ran the same exercise on Gemini and Grok. Both fulfilled the request. I still didn't figure out who this mystery person is that I think my friend looks like, but I thought that was a really interesting exercise. I was not aware. I've never hit the guardrails. I've never hit the ethics guardrails in any of the models before. My
Mhm.
my tasks are pretty generic and business focused. I do use it for medical stuff, like
Or-
my wife just got a mold test here and was ready to sell the house because it came back as we had high mold in certain places. And I was like, hold on, wait a second. Let me load this thing up into Chat GPT. And it gave a very kind of low risk assessment of the situation. But aside from that, I usually don't hit those guardrails. What is your take on that exercise? Are the guardrails really there, or did I happen to bump into them when I maybe shouldn't have?
No, I mean they're definitely. I think it's something that I think there's a tremendous amount of effort being given to making the systems have guardrails, and so they're definitely there. Most people never, it's one of the things that make my class like try to come up with things that trigger the guardrails to see the limits, right? But I think they're all there. They're different though, and they operate in different ways. Anthropic, for example, you mentioned they have an ethics constitution that the output's constantly being referred back to that ethics card, right? So some of them it's sort of on the end, on the back end. Uh, for them, it's in like the DNA of the system. So there's different different approaches to doing it. Generally, uh, so here's a problem, right? Whose ethics and which ethics get put into the system, right? And I mean, the ethics is very, I'll give you an example. Um, that trolley car problem, right, that I mentioned initially, my students will almost always pull the lever and kill one person to save five. I happened to teach a class of French business school students a few years ago. And just for fun, I asked them, no one would pull the lever.
Interesting.
Yeah, they, very, very different. So it's extremely culturally bound, right? And so if you're making a system that's going to be global, how do you know, decide whose ethics gets expressed and which are the right ones? And I mean, part of that is done, I think, through, and there, some sensitivity to this of changing it regionally, right? So that you can have some responses like that. And that works, I guess, to some degree, but it can't go too deep, frankly, right? Without getting problem. So that's one whole can of worms. I think the other problem is with any reasonably sophisticated technology is putting out some vision of what a good life entails, right? And maybe it's a miserable vision, but there's some vision there. Right? Like, does your life really entail clicking like buttons or safety over liberty, or those? But those choices are being made, and so that's another way that we have to look at these technologies and ask, is it really creating human well-being, and what do we mean by human well-being, right? And those are deeply ethical questions that frankly, you can spend a lifetime on that on that issue and not really come up with a firm answer, which is fine if you're a philosopher, but not for an engineer, right? You need an answer, and you need some kind of way of addressing the problem. So I think that's the space we're in, and so I always think of it as it's always sort of a tentative answer and an evolving process, and where we get in trouble is if we get too attached to the answers that we have.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the the US just released the Trump administration, the AI action plan,
Yeah,
and there was some interesting verbiage in there around DE and I, and as it relates to, it was essentially an anti-woke mandate for these models. And now again, whose ethics do we apply? Like, okay, maybe that's up your alley. Well, then the next administration comes in and has a completely different perspective
yeah,
on ethics and what these models, and we're blurring lines now between private and public sector in not just policies like this, but also the infrastructure requirements necessary to power this infrastructure, right? Like, so this computing infrastructure. So tremendous energy needs, cooling needs, there's environmental impact. There's going to be policy decisions that politicians are going to have a lot of influence over. And when people have influence, they typically leverage it, right? Especially in the political realm. So, I really see a blurring of lines. I mean, you have that in certain monopolistic industries, right? Where the government steps in, and um, in energy, for example, your local power company, it economically doesn't make sense to have more than one, right? You can't, the economics don't work. So you grant somebody essentially a regulated monopoly where you enforce profit margin caps and um, other things to ensure that that monopoly isn't being abused. But what is your take on how the government and private industry? We're still at the early stages. It's hard to see how commingled we're going to get, but we're already seeing policies come out that clearly have ethical implications.
oh, absolutely. Well, and I mean, I think one of the interesting things is policy is always trying to promote some vision of, again, a vision of a good life. So it's going to always have some kind of ethical foundation. Um, a lot of things there. I wanted to say something about DEI and um, and the action plan, right? Because you're right. I mean, it's very uh, clear that sort of anti wokeism is part of the foundation for that plan. And I think that's something that it cannot mean anti-diversity, though, right? Because the other goal of the plan, and maybe a bigger goal of the plan, is to build up the technology as quickly and effectively as possible. And there's plenty of empirical evidence that says diversity is going to help creativity and innovation. So how do you find that balance, right? And I think that's part of what we're doing with this new industry is like, where's the right balance? How do we do this? And social justice requires treating people justly. At the end of the day, right? It's so we have to kind of find the balances in all of that. As far as the other problem, and this is also quite new, I think, is the government's privatization of a lot of government functions, right? And we see this growing in a lot of ways over the last few decades. Prisons becoming private corporations, for example. What we're seeing now is gathering data is being privatized. And the problem is, whereas there are constitutional protections against, for example, surveillance that apply to law enforcement, a private corporation might be able to gather a great deal of data about a person without this sort of constitutional safeguards, right? So you don't have to go get a warrant if you're Facebook and you're looking at someone's like buttons and they're giving you the data, or and then if you happen to buy the data from, I don't know, say Amazon, and you know what a person's been shopping for, and on and on and on, and then put that together with the government data, which is being aggregated now. you can get a pretty thorough portrait of an individual from their call it data exhaust, right? That's going in many different directions. You find their emails through the say a private email exchange like Gmail. You can find this search what they're searching for online, what websites they visited. I think you get a pretty comprehensive vision. Uh, when it's that's used for marketing purposes, I mean, there's some problematic aspects to that. But when it's used for law enforcement, without a warrant, without probable cause, maybe, that's another can of works. And you see that being done more and more, and aggregated. And I think the sort of most talked about company doing that right now is Palantir, which is aggregating a lot of data and working for what we know the CIA and the I think New York Police Department and probably ICE, and they work with the uh, Ukrainian army. There's all sorts of different places around the world, and um, yeah, it raises flags. Red flags, and we worry about that from an ethics standpoint. Um, you know, our individual privacy is actually foundational for democracy. We need that private space. Um, when back during the old Soviet era, they would one way they would suppress dissent was just to record people and then play the recordings in public on the radio. Like if they had a dissident, there was one person, I think it was a Polish dissident, that they just recorded everything that in his apartment, cooking dinner in bed with his wife, everything, and just played it on the radio. And it was so
Wow.
humiliating. He, I think, committed suicide. So this is a known tool of oppression, is to just dissolve privacy rights. And so to see it being privatized, it raises some constitutional concerns about whether the government can delegate to law enforcement, I mean, to a private party, the collection of data that it couldn't do on its own, right? It's allowed, under the so what they call the third party doctrine, but it's the limits. There have to be limits to that too, right? So those are. I think that's as a legal scholar, that's a frontier that's worth exploring. There's gonna be a lot of interesting issues that come out of that.
Yeah.
Um,
When we were speaking last, you had mentioned that lawyers need more than just compliance
right.
checklists than when dealing with AI. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's a great example, right? Um, because you can have first of all, I divide the world into sort of three categories in this space. One is AI ethics, that is looking at the sort of philosophical theological foundations of ethics. The second is you might say AI governance, which usually deals mostly with compliance. And the third is AI safety, which is the more the computer science area of like how do we actually make this safe. Uh, the difference then is if you have just a checklist, a lot of compliance. I think a lot of compliance education products out there involve making sure all the boxes on the checklist are checked. And it's not quite enough because we have a rapidly evolving regulatory space. It changes almost every day, and at the federal level, last year we had a completely different regulatory regime than we did, or an emerging one anyway. Now it's different, and so if you can check all the boxes, you really may be you need to have today as a lawyer more of a like I mentioned like a statesman like approach where you can guide a client to where the likely pitfalls will be even before the regulation gets there, right? Or their reputation gets damaged even if there isn't a regulation. I think that's part of it, and you're beginning to see some companies. There's an article in the MIT review and Technology Review a few months ago about the H&M store, the fashion store. They were uh, making the claim that they're looking to send their compliance people back to school to learn the ethics so that they could understand the rules and the so regulatory space better, right? And I think for lawyers who that's really essential. It's essential to give better advice to clients. It's also essential for them in developing their professional identity, right? So that like one of the things we hope legal professionals do is to ask that question: do I really want to do this? Right? Is this a client I really want to take on? Are they doing something that I think is interest to society? So they need to have that that space. I mean that background.
Interesting. Yeah, and we talked too, like there's a lot of discussion in the industry about AI's role in the legal process, whether that's the
Yeah.
development of legal work product. I saw a really interesting study at the University of Oklahoma. You might have seen it as well, just a few days old, actually, maybe a few weeks at this point, where they tried to replicate a jury through the use of large language models, and they sampled a couple of hundred potential juror candidates and tried to model them based on demographics, age, ethnicity, professional profile, so on and so forth. And what they found was that the out of the box frontier models did not perform well in terms of predicting how jurors might respond to certain pieces of evidence, for example. Well, they did enough poking and prodding to figure out that the reason that these frontier models struggled was primarily because of all the safety and alignment controls that are in place. So they decided to and I didn't find out, they're going to be on the podcast here soon. Should be a great episode. They decided to take an open source model without all of that safety and alignment post training, and the that strategy worked infinitely better and was extremely accurate in modeling how these jurors would respond to certain pieces of evidence, which I thought was super fascinating. And when we talked last, you had mentioned that there's technical reasons why AI can't truly understand human complexity, and I agree with that. But this study kind of tells us we might be able to get close. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, um, I should say one of the great joys of my life is I get to work with some colleagues at NC State in computational neuroethics, which is a fascinating field. Um, I would say that where we are is we kind of can begin to recognize brain modules that are involved in moral reasoning, and we can build computational models of those, right? And so then you can begin to model moral reasoning much more in a much more sophisticated way. But it still is more like how should I put this? Like the modules are like Lego blocks, and the moral decision is like something you built with the Lego blocks, right? So there's a little of this, a little of that. So you get better. The problem, and I've done a lot of work on this over the years. Uh, you know, human experience, uh, the human experience that we can describe linguistically is probably 10 or 20% of our lived experience. It's fairly low, right? And language is often reaching beyond um, the limits of the word. Like this is how poetry works, right? Poetry, you're trying to use words to describe an experience that isn't quite reducible to the words. And there's an old Buddhist saying of the words are like fingers pointing to the moon, and you don't want to confuse the moon and the finger, right? You want to be able to say the real meaning is out there somewhere. Um, that poses some fundamental challenges for modeling, right? Uh, and because it's predictable maybe that, somebody will have a range of responses, but predictable, that ability to predict has to be computationally limited because uh, it's not just the enormous complexity of the mind, but as an evolved system, we have our brains reflect billions of random accidents in evolution over, you know, millions of years, and that's all information. There's tons of information encoded into us as physical organisms that is unable to be reduced to a rule, right, or a prediction, I think. And so we don't. That I think that's why a lot of it's not that there's some divine spirit necessarily moving, or maybe there is, yeah, in the human being, but just the enormous amount of information that is contained in our physical presence is it's irreducible information because it's a lot of it's random. And so how we react to a given situation is going to reflect all of that. Um, and I think much of our moral life reflects those kinds of experiences that are really difficult to reduce to language. They're really difficult to express in words. Um, and you can probably think of lots of them. I think of like one I like to use is when Shakespeare has Romeo say Juliet is the sun. It's literally nonsense, right? But if kind of have had that experience, you know what he's talking about, right? So he's using the words to point beyond the meaning, and I think that's a lot of our language is that way. Um, so what does that mean if you're using like an LLM, right? It's a language model. Um, it's there's a wonderful philosopher scholar named David Gunkel who writes on robots. Very great stuff he writes on robots and sort of uh, post-structural philosophy. And one of the things he wrote, fairly recently was like the large language model is the ultimate, disappearance of the author. It has no authorial intent, right? It's just like a mirror reflecting our own inputs. And that's interesting from that perspective, right? Because how could it then be reaching to meaning beyond the language model? It's a language model. It can't really reach to some meaning that lies beyond its own limits. And there's more formal ways to express that idea. And I'll drop another name, but Brian Cantwell Smith, another philosopher who has some great insights on that. And maybe from the 1970s, there was a great philosopher named Hubert Dreyfus who wrote a book called "What Computers Can't Do," and then he reissued it, I think, in the like 2010-ish or so, and as "What Computers Still Can't Do." So, and he makes a very similar point.
So this is a good segue in our agenda because we had planned to talk about the dangers of treating people like data points as opposed to unique individuals. So what are some of the risks of us even attempting to model our world and people numerically or digitally?
Yeah, in some ways, it's a modern or contemporary expression of a problem that's been around at least since the mid 20th century, maybe early 20th century, in bureaucracies. And we've all had this experience, right? Imagine when you go to the DMV and you wait in line all day. Are you being treated like a human being or just another data problem, data set, or I had to pay a traffic ticket not long ago. And here in North Carolina, you get in line to pay the ticket with all sorts of people. Let's just say with all sorts of fines to pay, and you wait in a long line. what you are there, at least it felt that way to me, is a risk profile. People are treating you as like, how much risk do you pose? And the problem with that, I think, is much more profound than is usually acknowledged, and it goes deep into our democracy. I think one of the things about, we tend to think nowadays of democracy as simply a procedural form of government, like, oh, voting and, going to the polls and some public discourse. But democracy runs deeper into being a sort of moral practice in itself, because at the end of the day, I think democracy depends on recognizing fellow citizens as human beings, even when you disagree with them, even when you don't like their policies, even when they're in the majority and you're in the minority and you don't like their policies, to recognize that what you're encountering is another person with human dignity that needs to be treated as a person with human dignity and basic rights. And you might even say the virtue of sort of civic love that is, I think, kind of fundamental to how you build communities. And, I mean, this is one of the critiques of sort of the liberal, um, sort of neoliberalism, is that it makes it difficult for individuals to, or that's not the right word. It's more better to say that individuals are foregrounded and communities sit in the background. And yet communities are often necessary and to be the site where the virtues are built so that individuals want to support the rights of others, right? If it all becomes just about the individual, then what you end up with is an unstable government where, I'll participate as long as I have a chance of winning, but if I don't, then I'll go to war against everyone, right? So in order to have more than, they call it, a modus vivendi, and have something more robust than that, we need institutions. We need to strengthen institutions like, you know, well, historically, we've relied on churches, schools, clubs, social service clubs, all they call those mediating institutions. And as early as around 2000, scholars began to say those kinds of institutions are disappearing, right? And now I think there was a famous book written by a sociologist named Robert Putnam called "Bowling Alone," and he pointed out that, back in the 50s, you can always, I can remember growing up watching like the Flintstones on TV, or Jackie Gleason's show, and they're always running off to their bowling leagues. And what happened to those? And those were kind of places where a lot happens more than just bowling, right? It's where you sit around and you talk about the day, and build up a sense of community. And we've really lost a lot of that, those institutions. And they're always, the ones that still exist are under constant attack. And the technology, especially post-COVID, right? I mean, COVID did a lot to help erode those institutions as well. So, I think that's a problem that it's related to technology, but it cuts really deep into sort of the pathology of contemporary liberal democracy.
Yeah, I know, and we're in a real short supply these days of respecting opinions and different views. I mean, to the point where I remember during the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, and there was a school teacher in Florida who posted on Facebook, somebody died. The bullet missed him or just barely grazed him and hit somebody in the audience. And this person was like, well, that's what they get for being on, at a Trump rally. And it's like, I don't care where you sit on the spectrum. It's like the sense of
Yeah.
human dignity and life is law, and on both sides. I mean, this is not a one side problem. It's all sides have we've really lost our way. And I do agree with you. It is that social fabric that used to exist and create bonds and community has eroded. And, we've taken socializing sometimes to social media, and, and that's not a healthy thing. So, you mentioned on our last call, and I know we're almost out of time here, but I wanted to touch on this because I think it's an important point. You had mentioned that we need humans in the loop for moral and legal decisions, and I wanted
Uh,
to get you to expand on that a little bit.
I want to do that in two ways. One is the sort of from a sort of technical democratic theory perspective. If you don't have humans in the loop, imagine you had a system, and there are people who advocate for this, that's entirely autonomous, right? With no human in the loop. Would the ruling seem legitimate to humans, right? I mean, there's something about like if it's not done by a human being, is it really legitimate for the human being? And I think because of that, in particular, that limitation on the ability to know what it feels like, right? That's important to mercy and justice. Actually, I wanted to say one other thing though. I want to end on a note that may be overly pessimistic, because for me, first of all, the divisiveness in our society, it's old, you know, and I can say that over the history of the nation, our enemies have often relied on our divisiveness to say we won't come together in a crisis, and they've always lost because we do come together. And I think that's part of the American spirit, and you see this unfortunately, we've had a lot of natural disasters in the last few years. Look at the communities that come together to help hurricane victims. And, I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about the people who live in that community bond together. I was out, we had a horrible disaster out in the western part of North Carolina last year. And, I know people who had like a well in their yard, and they were filling up water bottles and driving them into the city and distributing water bottles to whoever. Why? Because their neighbors needed it, right? And so, for all the divisiveness and all the rhetoric about divisiveness, there's also a fabric, almost intrinsic in us, that we pull together for our neighbors, and we always have. And so, I wonder, like where somebody's going to eventually try to see that divisiveness as a weakness in our country. And I think if they push hard enough, they're going to find, no, we actually will come together as a nation. It's which is to say, I don't think America's done yet. We have a lot of good years ahead. So
100%. I traveled for work in the late 90s and early 2000s, and pre and post New York City 9/11 it was shocking how stark the difference was post 9/11. Man, that city really pulled together, and it really became friendlier. I mean, you could argue the same about New Orleans post
yes,
Katrina. I love the city of New Orleans. The food and the culture and the music is just so rich. So I have noticed a real difference in the feeling in post Katrina New Orleans as well. So yeah, I would agree with you, and I think it's good to have that optimism. And because there is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, especially in this profession, as it relates to this technology that we're discussing and the implications to labor and to the industry itself. And I tend to take a more optimistic view to it, but there really is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I would imagine you see the same where you are.
yeah. I'll tell you though, one of the great blessings of teaching young people is they are optimistic. They have hope, and to see them with the care and concern they have for their communities and for the law is just it's a very positive thing. You
Yeah.
can't be too pessimistic when you work with young people, I think.
That's great to hear. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. This has been a different angle than I think we've taken in close to 90 episodes of doing this, and it's been really enjoyable. So I really appreciate you taking a little bit of time. And before we go, how do people find out more about the work that you do? Or, I know you're involved in the AI for Good with Kevin Frazier, and what's the best way for people to get familiar with what you do?
Well, I mean, I invite everyone to follow me on LinkedIn. I have a active LinkedIn profile. I have a Substack that I run called Ethics in the Age of AI. And God willing, I will have a book coming out on AI and democracy sometime in the coming year. So yeah, I welcome people to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, we'll include a link to your Substack and your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, so people can find you in the show notes. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been a great conversation.
I can't thank you enough for having me come by, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Thank you.
Awesome. You're very welcome. All right, we'll chat soon.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content.